Good morning and welcome to the Point. The continuing water crisis in Flint has the attention of legislators in Lansing. A special committee continues to look into solutions. We talked with one of those members who says he has some suggestions. Representative Jeff Irwin is a Democrat from Ann Arbor. We sat down with him this week. Representative, thank you for being on the show. Let's start with a little bit about your background, because I believe this is the first time you've been on, at least on the full show. So tell the viewers in West Michigan who may not be aware where you're from, what your background is.
Well, I'm originally from the UP, Sault Ste. Marie. I had an opportunity to move down to the Lansing area. I went to high school in East Lansing, then went over to U of M to go to school and study political science. I was intending on going into the law, but I got diverted on my way there into the world of politics. I ran for a seat on the county commission when I was an undergraduate and won. That pulled me into the world of local politics, got to learn a lot about municipal finance and public administration. I had an opportunity also to work for and run some environmental nonprofits advocating for clean air and clean water policy here in the state of Michigan and federally, also some in Illinois. And then in 2010, I ran for state representative and had the good fortune of being successful, and I've been serving in the State House for the last 5 years.
So with you and your final term, because of term limits, you have a number of things that you have focused on and wanted to work on, but one of the things that I suspect you never anticipated and none of us ever wanted was to see your appointment on a special committee, because nobody wanted this special committee to be appointed, the need for it to be appointed. And I'm reading this because it's kind of a long name, the Joint Select Committee on the Flint Water Public Health Emergency. Now your background, as you just said, clean water, clean air, environmental issues. This is really in your ballpark when it comes to your areas of interest and expertise. Talk to me a little bit about what the charge of this special committee is.
Well, the goal of the special committee is to uncover what went wrong and what we can do to prevent this from happening in the future, and also what we can do to make it right, both in the short term and in the long term.
You have other areas of jurisdiction when it comes to things like appropriations, and appropriations will be very important as to the long term, well, short term too, but certainly in the long term of how we deal with this. But what conclusions, if any, have you drawn from being on this committee and gathering this information about what it's really going to take to try to fix the problem in Flint? Because there are a lot of other questions. Why did it happen? As you point out, how did it happen? Where's the responsibility within government? We talk about all that. But it seems to me the most important issue is, how do you fix it and how quickly can you get it done?
Yeah, I think it's critically important that first we focus on the short term. Right now, people in Flint are still living day to day with bottled water. They're able to go down to a fire station or a water distribution center once a week and get a case of water, but most folks use a whole lot more than that. And just imagine having to bathe and cook, heating up water every day out of little plastic bottles. There's the expense of it. It's dehumanizing. The people of Flint are feeling tremendous trauma from not being able to trust the water that comes out of their tap, and from just the day-to-day rigmarole of having to get water and constantly think about, is my water safe? What am I doing to get water today and tomorrow and for the next week? So that's why one of my big frustrations throughout the entire state's response, and one of the arguments I've been making to my colleagues, both with amendments and behind the scenes, is we need to do more to address the short-term needs in Flint. There are things that we could be doing now that would help restore trust and would make the lives of people in Flint more normal. First and foremost, we need to be delivering water on a systematic basis to people's homes. We've got elderly people, we've got disabled people. They need to have water delivered to them. They shouldn't be required to rely upon the kindness of their neighbors to go down to the fire station and cart that water back. We got people with transportation problems. There's no reason why we can't deal with this problem like other communities have dealt with water disasters, like what happened in Toledo when Lake Erie water was fouled, like what happened in Katrina, or down in West Virginia when that river was polluted. We should be delivering water via water trucks in large volumes directly to people's homes, and delivering them drinking water in bottles, because these people are living on a permanent camping trip. I think it was recently remarked in one of the Detroit papers. I thought that was a great way of putting it. You can't do that for years, and we shouldn't expect the people of Flint to do that. The other big missing piece is that in order for us to restore trust and in order to make things right in the long term, we have to get to the infrastructure. The infrastructure has been horribly damaged, and the people of Flint are never going to be able to trust their water again until those lead service lines and many of those galvanized metal lines are removed and replaced. And That's not really happening. The governor has recommended $25 million in his budget. Even if that passes, that doesn't get to work until this October. We should have had shovels in the ground last fall. As soon as we knew that this problem was a real problem, and where some of these lead pipes were, we should have started replacing those and get to the next set of lead pipes as we discover where they are. We need a thorough replacement of the lead service lines.
What kind of dollars and cents? You talk about 25 million. It seems to me that would be really just the first step, because it seems like this would be a very expensive process. And I know that there's been some suggestion that there could be some federal money. I know that Representative Dan Kildee has been talking about that with some of his colleagues. But do we have any idea what the cost of the replacement of those lines would be and what the sources of revenue could be?
Yeah, I think we have a general idea, but I do think that until you really start to get those shovels in the ground and start to uncover those problems, we're not going to have it fully characterized. And that's why we need to get the work started immediately. I made an amendment a couple months ago to try to forward $55 million to the city of Flint to get that work started months ago. That amendment was unfortunately defeated. That was the number that Mayor Weaver indicated she felt was necessary to get at the lead service lines and I think the galvanized lines as well. If infrastructure needs to be replaced at the level of the water mains, I think it's going to start getting more expensive than that. But I think that's a pretty fair estimate of what it would take to really get at the lead service lines.
Does that deal with just the service lines, or does that deal with the homes as well? Because there no doubt are homes. I think your colleague Senator Ananick told me on this show not long ago, he lives in a house that was built in the 20s. He's virtually assured that there are lead pipes within his home.
Yeah, my understanding of that $55 million estimate was geared towards getting at the lead service lines and the compromised plumbing in the homes, but I think that depends upon how you define compromised. And like I said, I think that once those shovels do get in the ground and we really start a fulsome and thorough effort to replace this infrastructure, we're going to have a better idea of how many homes are in that position where they have just where the water has really corroded and destroyed the internal plumbing. I think another big question that we're going to face as we get deeper into this is how many water heaters have we destroyed? How many other appliances or other systems have been corroded to the point of uselessness through the use of this water for so long?
That's an interesting question, because that could be washing machines or ice makers or any number of other things that this corrosive water in. I mean, at one time this water was considered so corrosive that General Motors quit using it in their plant because of the damage it was causing to some of the parts that they were making. So that suggests that there is potential damage to other appliances.
Exactly. Yeah.
When you look at this from this committee's perspective, and you say, let's just take that $55 million piece for a moment. If that $55 million would do everything that needs to be done, and if magically that $55 million would materialize, how long would it take, do you think, to physically go do this work? Because we've seen water projects on a much smaller scale take months or years to complete, because it's not an easy task. You have to dig up roads and streets and yards, and everything has to start over again.
Yeah, well, it really depends upon how thorough and complete the effort is. I've heard the plumbers come forward and say, we can do this, and we can do this in a year, but you got to put us to work right now. That's why I think it's so essential that when the public learned about this last fall, the state were to step in and say, look, we know this is our responsibility. We know that we've damaged this infrastructure through bad policy and bad decision making and indifference to the concerns of the locals, and we're going to make it right, and we're going to start right now getting shovels in the ground. If we had done that then, I think we'd be looking at maybe having this work done before this next winter. At this point, if we don't get started until this fall, we're asking the residents of Flint to probably wait a couple more years, which I think is way too long.
When you think of this in total, one of the things you talked about was getting people to trust their water again. Even if the state or the feds or an independent contractor came into your house in Flint and said, your water's fine, as a resident of Flint, wouldn't you have a hard time turning that tap on and handing that glass of water to your 5-year-old kid?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to identify with the trauma that the people in Flint have felt. And I have to tell you, on my trips to Flint and when we had the public hearing in Flint a couple weeks ago, that was one of the things we heard loud and clear, is that people are traumatized, and it's changed their relationship with their water forever. And I've heard stories from people who say even when they go to other cities and they go to wash their hands or they go to get a drink of water, that they're second guessing whether or not that water is safe. That's going to take a long time to rebuild that trust. And I think that we need to stick with the people of Flint while we rebuild that trust. And the first step to rebuilding that trust is to really engage thoroughly in the effort to make it right. Like I said, make sure people have water delivered to them in a systematic way and start replacing the infrastructure that the people cannot trust. And that process is going to take some time to rebuild that trust.
It's trusting the water, but it's also trusting government at all. And the people of Flint are going to have a long way to go. I mean, look, the city is now getting attention in some ways that it probably should have for the past 30 years for some of the issues like education, nutrition, and some of those things. The damnable shame is that it took this tragedy for it to happen. But for those people who have gone through this, for those citizens, for those people who are taxpayers, I mean, what do you think it will ever take for them to trust government again?
Well, Flint's been through a lot, as you mentioned. Flint was abandoned by GM. It was abandoned by the state's lack of a real urban policy. The state has really turned its back on its core cities, and the industry that built its corporation and its economic viability off of the backs of the people of Flint. That corporation turned its back on Flint as well. So the people of Flint have been through a tremendous amount. I do think that the state can rebuild that trust if we're serious about helping with some of the wraparound services that we haven't talked about yet. If we are helping with the mental health needs, the early childhood education needs, and if we're helping with economic redevelopment in a way that is meaningful and is geared towards trying to provide good, high-paying, long-term jobs to people in Flint.
One of the concerns that has been expressed by some folks is that the current legislature is living this. They have been here while this developed. They have seen it on the news. They have seen it make national headlines, and they have reacted to the needs of the people in Flint to some degree. You can assess whether that is appropriate enough, and clearly you think more action should be taken. But nonetheless, there is some sense by the current elected members that Flint is a priority in this state. But because you can't hold the next set of legislators to an appropriation down the road, how concerned are you that when the national spotlight comes off Flint, when the television cameras leave, that the folks that will come after you in the building across the street will still have the same urgency that this legislature has, even if that urgency isn't enough, for you and many others?
I mean, I think that's a valid concern, but I do think it cuts both ways. One of the ways in which getting a new crop of legislators in here would be helpful is that they won't be tied to the bad decisions that led to the Flint water crisis. And we just heard a report this morning from the governor's task force on what happened in Flint. And one of their key findings is that the changes to the emergency manager law in 2011 were absolutely at the core of the indifference that the people of Flint felt when they went to their emergency manager, their local government, which was replaced by the governor's office. When they went to that person and said, look at my water, it's brown, it's smelly, it's giving me rashes, I need help. And when that emergency manager turned their back on those people, and when they couldn't get help from the state government or their governor, that was really at the core of not only why the Flint water crisis happened, but why it wasn't fixed earlier. Now, one of the problems we have in the current legislature is that many of the legislators who are serving now voted for that emergency manager law. And then they voted for it again after the citizens rejected it. And so, politically speaking, maybe it would be helpful to get some voices in here and some minds in here who don't have their own political viability wrapped up with this terrible emergency manager law that is at the core of what happened in Flint.
We'll have more with Representative Irwin in just a moment. To the point. Welcome back to the Point. The Flint water crisis has created a lot of conversation in Lansing about how to fix the problem and how to take care of the long-term effects. We talked to one of the members of a special committee looking into just that, State Representative Jeff Irwin. I want to talk about another issue that stems from Flint that is concerning, because I remember as a much younger high schooler, there was something called Legionnaire's disease that was, at least from my standpoint, something brand new I'd really never heard about. And it broke out, and there was a great fear because there were a number of people who lost their lives because of this almost inexplicable disease. In the past 24 months, past 18 months, in the city of Flint, we've seen a remarkable number of Legionnaire's cases. And the people who look at this disease, the specialists, the state health agencies, say they can't rule in or out the connection between the water supply in Flint and these diseases. As a citizen, that's concerning, because the question is, if it isn't from the water, then what is it from? Yet we're told some of these cases may not have been exposed. So have you looked into it through this committee? Has that been a focus of what you have talked about with some of your colleagues and some of the medical experts?
Yeah, and I mean, just as a bit of a preamble, I mean, we heard from families in Flint and parents who are just grief-stricken with the idea that their children have been drinking this water and they've been drinking this water, and they don't know what kind of health impacts it's going to have on them. They don't know how it's going to affect their education and their whole lives. And so parents are really grief-stricken. But as you point out, I mean, there's 12 people who've died as a result of this. We should all mourn those deaths, and we should all recognize that this Flint water crisis has taken the lives of 12 people through Legionnaire's disease. We have talked about that, and one of the things that is striking to me is that when the city of Flint hired experts to look into the use of the Flint River water as a source, the experts from Veolia and some other companies pointed out that not only was the water very corrosive and that they were going to have to add corrosion controls and add new treatment equipment to their plant for that, they also pointed out that the river water was going to be much higher in bacteria and pathogens, and that they were going to have all sorts of water quality problems related to issues like Legionnaire's disease. And despite the fact that they had these reports saying that they needed to use corrosion control and needed to install this equipment, and despite these reports stating explicitly that they were going to have problems with bacteria and pathogens like Legionnaire's disease, they didn't do anything to address these issues as far as I can tell. And so tremendous negligence, tremendous incompetence, tremendous indifference from the folks at DEQ, and the result is 12 people have died. Now, I don't know very much about the pathology and the science, the medical science around Legionnaire's disease, and how difficult it is to link the samples that they found in the buildings with the samples that they've taken from the people's bodies. I don't know how easy that is to match up, so it's hard for me to answer that part of the question. But to me, this really striking fact is that the city and the DEQ and the emergency managers were warned that this was a potential result, and as far as I can tell, they did nothing to address it.
Moving forward, there are a lot of things that you've already identified, but you talked about some wraparound services. Some of those things, and I think those include some of the things I mentioned, like nutrition and education, some of those and others that you mentioned. Those services, I mean, for example, there's a large segment of the city of Flint that isn't serviced by a grocery store at all. It's a food desert, I think is they're referred to. The services that can be offered and can be developed there are also things that need to be supported by the state. That's separate from whatever it costs to redo the infrastructure. How willing do you think your colleagues are to make that type of a commitment too? Because that too is a long term.
Yeah, I think there is bipartisan agreement that we have to make the situation better in Flint, that we have to offer these services, and that the state's responsible. Every credible report that's come out about the Flint water crisis has really settled on the idea that the state has primary responsibility because of the failures at the DEQ and because of the fact that the city of Flint was under direct supervision of the emergency manager and the governor's office. So the accountability to the state, the culpability of the state is clear. So I think there's really agreement that we need to do those things. I think the struggle is going to be how much. Those items become expensive. Now, the governor has recommended in this budget, which we're going to vote on here in a month or so, that we put about $200 million into early childhood education, nutrition supports, health assessments, health screenings, and some dollars also into the infrastructure and the paying of a percentage of the individual's water bills. I think that you'll see support for that kind of appropriation. I don't know if it's going to be exactly there, because I do find that many of my colleagues realize that there are problems with water quality in their communities, and they're looking for a way to make sure that the Flint Water Crisis and the sorts of investments that the state makes as a result of that help their communities as well. So, you know, I think that there's going to be some jostling and some movements around this, but I think fundamentally you're going to see bipartisan agreement that we need to do something to make sure that these kids get the wraparound services they need, and make sure that adults get the wraparound services they need as well. You know, mental health services is a big thing that hasn't been talked about lately, and we talked about the trauma earlier that people in Flint have felt, and it's not just the kids who need that kind of support.
We are almost out of time, but what is more remarkable to me is that you are almost out of time. It seems like you just came into this office. Term limits have a way of quickly moving by us, and so now as you come into the final months in office, what have you found in Lansing that has surprised you since you took office?
That's interesting. You know, these rules we have that mandate legislative inexperience are a little bit curious to me. You know, I know that when people are seeking a healthcare professional, if you're going to have heart surgery, you probably wouldn't want a brand new doctor who've never done the procedure before. You probably wouldn't get this idea that, well, they've done 100 bypasses, so they're probably kind of sick of it now and they've lost the spirit for it, you know. But people do have that attitude about public servants that are in the elected role. You know, one of the things that I've learned while I'm here is that term limits dramatically increase the power of the special interests, dramatically increase the power of the groups that are here lobbying the legislature to try to get whatever it is that they want. And it diminishes the power of the people through their elected representatives. And I think that that's one of the reasons why you had results like we had around the emergency manager law back in 2011. People weren't thinking about the unintended consequences. The legislators maybe didn't have a long history in local government to understand how valuable it is to have local officials who are responsible to their public. They didn't understand what would be lost if you swept that element of democracy and local control away. And so, you know, the inexperience that is running the show up here is disappointing, and I think we're seeing it in our decisions about schools. I think we're seeing it in our decisions about local government, and we're seeing that a disrespect for the work that government does ends up resulting in the kinds of failures that we saw in Flint and we're seeing elsewhere.
Our thanks to Representative Irwin, and we'll have more when we come back to The Point. As the state legislature continues to try to find a solution for the problems in Flint, they're also looking for a way to take care of the long-term implications, and it's a story we'll continue to follow. But there are other important stories coming out of Lansing. For example, the legislature right now is working on a budget for next year. We'll be talking about that in coming Sundays when you join us at 10 o'clock for To The Point.